MikroTik configuration practice, network address translation, PPPoE and DHCP. In this video, we will skip with the usual rundown of objectives and go straight rather to practice task proper. So the first MikroTik router in this topology will perform the NAT function or network address translation function. It is connected to an ISP router on Ether 1 or port number 1 and is connected to router number 2 via Ether 5 or port number 5. We have the first 6 tasks to accomplish, so let's head over to router 1. So this is our router number 1, which is a MikroTik Hub AC Lite, and listed here are the 6 tasks or initial tasks that we have to perform on this router. So first is to export the firewall filter rules, and it will serve as our base filter rules. So this is a MikroTik in default configuration. So if you notice, we have a bridge and other settings such as IP address is under the default configuration. So it has also the default IP firewall filter rules. So these are rules that comes with the MikroTik default configuration. So in this version 6.47.1, so you have this particular set of rules, and this is the one that we have to export. So in order to export these firewall filter rules, so we go to more, new terminal. So again, we need to click the more because we are on zoom in view. So if not, it's just directly go to the new terminal. So again, more, new terminal, and we are here at the command line interface of our MikroTik router. So first, we need to go to the IP firewall filter menu. So we need to type in the command export followed by file and the name of the file that we want. So base filter will be our file name for this instance. Of course, you could name it whatever you want. Then the file extension. And the filter rules are being exported to this file. We can go to the files menu, and from here you will see that our base filter.rsc, the exported filter rules, hopefully is here inside, and we could click this one and click download to download this file to our local computer. So I'll right click, download, and save it to our desktop. So I've opened our base filter RSC via VS Code. So from here you'll see the filter rules in their command line form. So MikroTik provides these filter rules as a default configuration. So in order to provide or to help in the security aspect of our network device. So as you can see, for example, we have a rule that will drop any input connection if the source is not from the LAN interface list. So you have also other filter rules here that will also drop connection if the connection state is invalid, or drop the connection if it is coming from the one interface list but it's not with a DST NAT or destination NAT. I would like to comment out this filter rules, which is to perform a fast track connection of any forward connections. So for established and related, of course. So because we are implementing PPPoE bandwidth limitation, and any fast track connection bypasses those restrictions. So we don't want this in our scenario. So we could add the number sign or the hash sign to this particular line, and also you could include the below one to comment out this particular line of filter rule. So all I need to do to put some distinction on the file name, so I will just save as this to a different name. So for instance, modified base filter will be the name. So this one will be imported or uploaded later for configuration of the filter rules. So next task is to reset to no default configuration. So we would like to start from scratch, but of course we will have our base filter rules later. So in order to reset to no default configuration, so you go to System, Reset Configuration, and from here you have the choices. Check the no default configuration. I would like also to do not back up anything from this configuration. So I will also check with that. And I will click the reset configuration to proceed with this process. So we can click the reset configuration and you have another confirmation window, which is if you want to reset or confirm to reset all your configuration and reboot. So during this step, before you click yes, be very precise that this is the device that you want to really reset. If you are in doubt, you can click no and review the other menus if indeed you want this device to be resetted to a no configuration or default configuration for that matter. So in our case, because this is a demonstration device, we are okay to reset all configuration, in fact to no default configuration, and confirm reboot. Okay, so the device has rebooted, so we can check the logs to see if indeed it's really rebooted. And yes, from the logs the router has rebooted, and to confirm that it is really no default configuration, so we don't have any IP supposed to be. We don't have any bridge ports now and any port assignment to the bridge, and the IP firewall filter rules is not there. In fact, there is no NAT rules as well, and there are many other settings under the default configuration that will be gone, of course, during when we reset to no default configuration. So next, let's go to task number 3, which is to import filter rules. So before we could invoke the import command, so let's go to files, and we would want our file, which is our modified base filter rules, to be uploaded first. So let's click upload and find the appropriate file. So in our case, so this is the modified base filter. So you'll notice also that the base filter is gone because it's not inside the flash directory. So once rebooted, any file that is outside will be gone. So base filter or the modified base filter is here. So now we could continue with importing the filter rules. So the end result is actually if we go to IP firewall filter rules, so those rules that are with the default configuration will be back here. So let's go to more, new terminal, and do the import of the filter rules. So now let's invoke or type the command import file dash name and just do a tab or type in the file name or modified base filter.rsc. So for this demonstration, I make it as realistic as possible, wherein if I press enter, I would expect that there is an error of the script. And to know what is it, is just simply press enter and continue with the import. And there you go, you have an error. Input does not match any value of the interface list. So what happens is the import actually proceeded, but if you take a look at the filter rules, it stops wherein there is a filter rule line that will make use of an interface list. Since we don't have any interface list, because in our step we have written it that on step number 6 only that we will create interface list. So to make it as realistic as possible, I made it such a way. So we will now move this creation of interface list and perhaps type it as 3.1 and the import of the filter rules instead of 3.2 step. So what we can do, perhaps a cleaner solution or way, is to delete first every filter rules that are added and create the interface list first before we run the import command again. So we go to interfaces, interface list, and add a list here by clicking this list button and click the plus sign and add the name of the interface list, which is LAN, and another for WAN. Okay, so click OK, and we now have the lists LAN and WAN. So now we could go back to our command line and just click an up arrow to retype in the import command, and by pressing enter, so now we don't have any issue. The script file is loaded and executed successfully. And to verify, if we go to IP firewall filter rules, so we now have the default filter rules. So next is step number 4 or task number 4, which is to change the system identity. So currently the system identity or the host name for this device is on its default MikroTik, and we need to change to a simpler one, which is NAT. So let's fulfill this task. So to change the system identity, so we go to system identity and simply change the identity from MikroTik to the intended host name, which is that. So we click OK to accept the new identity. So next, task number 5 is to turn off the IP services or the services that are not needed. So at least for this demonstration, it's not needed. So we have services API SSL, Telnet, and www. So we go to IP services. So these are the default services that are open or our MikroTik device is listening into. So let's go ahead, turn off the services. For example, API. Let's click the X sign or disable. So API SSL as well. Click the X sign and you have Telnet and www. So Telnet X or disable, www X or disable. Still in router number 1, we will configure PPPoE client, check if it is authenticated and connected, add this new interface to the one interface list, configure IP address on Ether5, which is the interface connected to our router number 2, add Ether5 to LAN interface list. We will then configure NAT and create some routes towards the local networks behind our router number 2. Let's accomplish task number 7, which is to configure PPPoE client interface on Ether1 with the following credentials. So the way to do it is to go to interface tab, and drop down and find the PPPoE client. So we can go to general tab and whether accept this name or type in a descriptive name. So for instance, PPPoE name will be PPPoE ISP1, and interfaces. So which interface this PPPoE client is tied to. In our case, it's Ether1, so we will accept this one. Next, we click the Dial Out tab and supply the username and password. And we will use the provided username. So we'll copy in and paste it on the user text field and as well as the password. Okay, so username and password, we are okay with adding the default route, and we will just add DNS. I will not check the use peer DNS. We are okay with the other settings. So let's click apply and let's click OK. So as you can see, our PPPoE client interface is with an R flag or running. So if we double click and click the status tab, so we have a local address supplied by our PPPoE server. So this is the remote address or the IP that is on the other side of the PPPoE. We can also check if we have the default route installed. So we go to IP routes, and yes, we have a default route installed, which the gateway is going out to the PPPoE interface. Then we could check if we have internet connection. Let's go to Tools, Ping, and ping a public IP address. So quadruple 8, and yes, there is a reply. How about quadruple 9? And yes, there is a reply. Task number 8 is to add this PPPoE client interface to our one interface list. So we go to interface list, and here's a review. We have already the interface list. It's only that we don't have any interface assigned to a interface list. So let's add. So click the plus sign, and the list will be WAN, wide area network. So the interface will not be Ether1, but instead it should be the PPPoE client interface. In this case, it should be the interface name, which is PPPoE-ISP1. So click apply, click OK, and we now have our PPPoE interface added to the one interface list. Step 9 is to simply add or configure an IP address on Ether5. So Ether5 is our connection to router number 2. So we will just put a comment here to router number 2. So it is already connected. So we don't have yet an IP address. So that's why we will configure an IP address. So let's configure an IP address. So we go to IP addresses. So we have already an IP address here, which is for our PPPoE interface, which is added dynamically. So we will add a static IP address on our Ether5 with an IP of 172.16.0.1/30. So let's add the IP address. Click the plus sign. So the IP will be 172.16.0.1/30. So it's on interface Ether5. We could supply a network address or simply click apply to make the MikroTik populate the network address for us. So click apply, and there you go. You have the network address, and click OK to accept the new configured static IP address on our Ether5 interface. Next, task number 10, which is to add Ether5 to the LAN interface list. So before we add this Ether5 to the LAN interface list, notice I did not perform a ping because we don't have an IP address yet on our router number 2. So we will just perform our ping, see if our router 1 and router 2 is able to reach one another via this IP address if we have configured our router number 2. So let's proceed to add Ether 5 to our LAN interface list. So we go to interface list, and click the plus sign. So this time we will select LAN or local area network, and we will select the Ether 5 interface. So click apply, click OK, and we now have our Ether 5 is a part of our LAN interface list. Next, step 11 is to configure network address translation. So network address translation is not always mandatory, especially if we have access to the upstream router and we could provide a route back to our local networks. In our case, we don't have any access to that one, or let's assume that we don't have any access to that one, and we could not create a route back to our local area networks. So instead, we configure network address translation. So NAT can be configured in the following menu: IP, Firewall, and we go to the NAT tab. So let's click the plus sign. So we have chain, source NAT, or source translation. Again, we could supply source address, and or we go to advance the source address list. But for this demonstration, let's keep it simple. So chain is source NAT. So although we have only a single interface, and we could go to out interface list and select the PPPoE, but let's just prepare our configuration that we will assume that will be future ISP connection. So we will make use of out interface list, and we will select the one interface list. And then let's go to action, and we will select the action masquerade. So general is chain source NAT, out interface list is WAN, action is masquerade. So click apply and click OK to accept the new NAT rule. Task number 12 is to create static routes. So router number 1, or our NAT MikroTik, needs to know how to go back to this network, which is the PPPoE pool, and the other network, which is the DHCP pool. So we need to add a static route, and we will pass our traffic destined to this network to our router number 2, which will be addressed as 172.16.0.2. Let's create our static routes. So in order to create a static route in MikroTik, we go to IP routes, and we go to the routes tab, and we will click the plus sign. Let's add our first static route. So the destination address, so we'll just copy this one and put it here on our destination address field. The gateway will be 172.16.0.2. So again, this will be the IP address of our router number 2. So we are 172.16.1. We will pass any traffic destined to 10.100.100.0/24 to 172.16.0.2. So we will accept the default settings on the other values. So click apply, click OK. So we could click the plus sign and add our next static route, or we could make use of the copy feature here in our MikroTik. So let me show you. So this is our first route. So we'll double click and click copy. So this one will be the duplicate of the first route that we have. So we will change the destination address to the next network that we want our MikroTik to know. So it will still be the same gateway. So that is why copy is usable in this scenario instead of adding a new route. So we will still accept the settings. So click apply, click OK. So we'll click OK or close the copy static route. So we will notice that we now have two newly static routes that we have added. We are now ready to configure our router number 2. So the initial steps are basically the same as router number 1. We will export and import our base filter rules, change the system identity, turn off IP services that are not needed, and create interface lists. So we are now at our router number 2, and these are the steps that we need to do for this MikroTik. So step 1 or task number 1, 2, and 3 are basically the same as what we have in our first MikroTik router. So we don't need to perform an export firewall filter rules since we have already the modified base filter rules. So we could go ahead, reset to no default configuration, and adding that particular RSC file. First, we need to upload the modified base filter rules. So we could do that by going to Files and click Upload. And let's find our modified base filter rules. And this will upload this file to this particular MikroTik router. So we could perform the task number 2, which is to reset to no default configuration. So we go to System, Reset Configuration, check the no default configuration, and check the donut backup. So what if you ask me if why not we will run after reset the modified base filter rules or RSC file before we click this reset configuration. So take note, what's inside the base filter will make use of the interface list. So since we don't have any interface list yet, so running this RSC file will have some issues. So we will just import it back after we are done with the reset. So we have performed the reset to no default configuration. So if we want to verify, so on our logs, so the router has rebooted. And if we go to the IP address, for example, there is no default IP address. On our interface list, there is no default interface list. Our IP firewall filter rules are not there. The NAT rule is not there. So therefore, this is resetted to a no default configuration. So as we learned from our router number 1, we need to create our interface list before we can import the filter rules. So let's quickly add the two interface list. So let's have LAN and let's have WAN. Okay, so interface lists are added. Then let's import now our modified base filter rules. So we go to new terminal and type in the import command and the name of the RSC file. In our case, it's modified base filter.rsc. Hit enter and the script file is loaded and executed successfully. Let's quickly check if our modified base filter rules are there. So IP firewall, and we go to filter rules, and yes, we now have our filter rules. So let's do task number 4, which is to change system identity. So we go to system identity and change it to PPPoE. Click OK. So let's turn off the IP services that are not needed. So IP services. And let's turn off the API SSL, Telnet, and triple W. More configuration needed on our router number 2. We have task 7 to 11 to fulfill. Let's configure IP address on Ether 5. or going to our router number 1. So with an IP address of 172.16.0.2/30. So we go to IP addresses, click the plus sign. So 172.16.0.2/30 on Ether 5 interface. So click apply, click OK. So let's perform some ping tests, see if we could reach from our router 2 the IP address of router 1. So we go to tools ping. So 172.16.0.1. So we are .2. We will ping or try to reach .1, which is our router number 1. And yes, there is a reply from our router number 1. So let's do step 8 or task 8, add Ether 5 to one interface list. So we go to interfaces, interface list. We have already our interface list. We simply add an interface to an interface list. So Ether 5 will be on our one interface list. Click apply, click OK. So remember, we have some IP firewall filter rules which have some one interface list. So let's verify if it's affected. If adding it to an interface list will pose some problems on our connection to our router 1. And so far we could perform some ping test or ICMP. Next, task number 9 are to create bridge interfaces and add its bridge port members. So we have two bridge interfaces, which is PPPoE-bridge and LAN bridge. So let's add these two bridges first. So we go to bridge. So we go to bridge tab, click the plus sign, and the name of our first bridge is PPPoE bridge. We will accept the default settings, so click OK. We will add the second bridge and rename it to the LAN-bridge. We will accept the default settings, click OK. We will then add the bridge port members. So for PPPoE bridge, it will be port number 1 and port number 2. So we go to ports, click the plus sign. So Ether 1 will be on PPPoE bridge. So we will click OK. Let's add the second member, which will be Ether 2. Next, for our LAN bridge, Ether 3 and 4 will be the bridge port members. So click the plus sign, Ether 3. This time it will be for LAN bridge. So click OK. Plus sign again, Ether 4 on our LAN bridge. So click apply or click OK. Next, task number 10 is to configure IP address on our LAN bridge interface. So we go to IP addresses. So we have our Ether 5. Let's add one more for our LAN bridge interface. So that will be 200.200.1/24. Let's click apply and click OK. So we now have an IP address for our LAN bridge interface. So we won't be having any IP address for our PPPoE bridge interface. Let's do step 11, which is to configure DHCP server on our LAN bridge interface with the following settings. So let's close this one. So we go to IP DHCP server and let's just do the DHCP setup. So let's click the DHCP setup and select the appropriate interface, which is LAN bridge. So click next. So the DHCP address space is correct because that is the network address of our LAN bridge interface. So click next. The gateway for the DHCP network will be the IP address of the LAN bridge interface. So that's correct. Click next. Addresses to give out. So that will be 10 to 100. So let's modify the fourth octet. So we could expand this one and change the 254 into 100, and we are good to go. So click next. DNS servers, we will have 2 for this demonstration. So quadruple 8 and quadruple 9. Click next. The least time is 1 hour, so the default one is 10 minutes. So let's change it to an hour. So click next to complete the DHCP server setup. Finally, we have 3 remaining tasks on our router number 2. Task number 12 is to add the LAN bridge interface to the LAN interface list. So we could go to Interfaces, Interface List, and click the plus sign. The list will be LAN, and we will select the LAN bridge. Click Apply, click OK. Task number 13 is to configure PPPoE Server. So let's go to PPP menu, and as you can see, we have the required settings. So we have PPPoE pool, we have interface, we have service, and we have the DNS settings. We need to create the profile, we need to create the secret. So let's do first the PPPoE pool, and that will be 10, 100, 100, 10 to 100. So we go to IP pool and click the plus sign. So PPPoE pool, and let's add the address 10, 100, 100 at 10 to 10, 100 at 100 at 100. So click apply, click OK. So review if we have some typo errors. So we don't have. Okay, so click close, and we will now add in the profile first. So click profiles and click the plus sign, and we could name it as PPPoE profile. Next is the local address, that will be 10, 100, 100.1. The remote address is the PPPoE pool. We can go down and add in our DNS server, which is 8.8.8, and the secondary DNS server will be 8.8.4.4. Not here is the addition of the interface list. So we will add this PPPoE profile or this PPPoE connection to the LAN interface list. Let us just add some sample limits, although it's not indicated here. So we have limits for our receive and for our upload, which is 5M. So general, so we have the name, local address 10, 100, 100.1, the remote address, PPPoE pool, interface list will be LAN, DNS servers, our sample limits. Click apply, click OK, and we are done with our profile. Next is for our test PPPoE user. So we go to secrets, click the plus sign. So the username or the name is user1. The password will be pass1. Service could be any, but we could be precise, PPPoE. The profile will be our profile that we just recently created, PPPoE profile. We don't need to do any settings here. So let's just review user1, pass1, PPPoE, the correct corresponding profile. Click apply, click OK. So let us just add the PPPoE server binding before we enable the PPPoE server. So let's click the plus sign and find PPPoE server binding. Let's just name it as the user name. So PPPoE user1. So we could identify that this particular PPPoE connection is for this user1. So the user will be user1. we could leave the PPPoE service. So click apply, click OK. So we now are ready to create our PPPoE server. Let's configure a PPPoE server. So click the plus sign. So the service name could be your descriptive service name, or we're okay with service 1 for this demonstration, and or it's PPPoE service. So let's just rename it to what is prescribed, PPPoE service. And interface will be the PPPoE bridge. We could change the MTU values, but for now, let's skip it. So we have changes also to the default profile. If you have some limitation profile, you could also change it. One session per host. You could change the authentication values as well. But for now, let's leave it as default. Click apply, click OK. So it's disabled. Let's enable this one, our PPPoE service. So the name or the service name, the interface, the one session per host. We will only allow one session per host as the name implies. So other than that, we don't change any values for this demonstration. Task number 14 is to create a static default route to our gateway, which is 172.16.0.1, which is our router number 1. So we will only have one route, which is anyway going to our router number 1. So we could achieve it by going to IP routes. So we have connected routes here. So on the routes tab, click the plus sign. So the default route, any IP address, any subnet mask. So the gateway will be 172.16.0.1, our router number 1 Ether5 IP address. So we will just accept the default settings. So click apply, click OK. So now we could check if our router number 2 has an internet connection. We go to tools, ping, and let's see if we have internet or we could reach public IP addresses. I could reach quadruple 8 IP address, and I could reach quadruple 9. Let's configure some DNS server for this router, IP DNS, and let's use quadruple 8. Click OK. So let's do some ping test, see if we could resolve some names. So more new terminal. So let's do a ping to www, for example, facebook.com. And yes, we are able to resolve facebook.com, ping www.youtube.com. And yes, we are able to resolve as well this particular domain name. All is left, assuming we have a correct or sufficient configuration, is to test on our clients. We have one for our PPPoE connection and one client for DHCP connection. So we are now here at our client 1 MikroTik router, which is a MikroTik hoplite. So this is in no default configuration. So as you can see, there is no default configuration present in this particular router. No filter rules, no bridge. So this is to test our PPPoE connection. So let's go to our interfaces menu, interface tab, and drop down and select the PPPoE client. We are okay with the PPPoE out, the interfaces. So we will select Ether1 since this PPPoE is running on or connected to Ether1. So next we go to dial out tab and supply the necessary credentials. So for user, that will be user1, password, that will be pass1. We will accept the default check. Okay, we could use the peer DNS as well. add default route, and the authentication remains unchanged. So click apply, click OK. And as you can see, we have the R flag on our PPPoE out or PPPoE client interface. If we double click on this PPPoE client interface and go to status, so we have uptime and our local address. We are given the 10.100.100 IP address, and this is the address on the other side of the PPPoE tunnel. So we could also check if we have an internet connection. So let's do a check. So we could go to tools ping and type in the public IP address, for example, quadruple 8. And yes, there is a reply, quadruple 9. And yes, there is also a reply. We could also check if we acquire the DNS servers, so IP DNS. And yes, we have acquired DNS servers from the PPPoE connection. So therefore, we could also do a test, new terminal, and do a ping to www.youtube.com. And yes, there is a reply, ping www.mikrotik.com. And yes, there is a reply. So all is in place in our client number 1 PPPoE connection. So we have a successful PPPoE connection. In fact, we have an IP address. We have also a default route coming from the PPPoE connection. We acquire some DNS servers, and we have tested and performed some ping tests that we are able to go to public IP addresses and resolve public domain names. Also, before we go to client number 2, we could test if the PPPoE limits are being applied to this client number 1. So let us do some bandwidth test and test our connection towards the router number 1. So direction for receive and transmit. So the user is admin and the default password. So as you can see, our transmit and our receive is not hitting more than 5 Mbps, or we are below or near 5 Mbps. So therefore our PPPoE limits are in place. So we are here at our client number 2, our test client for DHCP connection. So this is a MikroTik Hub Mini this time. So for client number 2, I did not bother to reset it to a no default configuration. So if you can see, it has still the built-in filter rules, the NAT rules. NAT rule is still there. The bridge interface and the ports is still there. So it's still on its default configuration. So default configuration is sufficient because the default configuration, the IP DHCP client is on Ether 1, and this Hub Mini or client number 2 is connected to our router number 2 via Ether 1. And as you can see, it already acquired an IP address that is on the DHCP pool that we have configured. If we will verify and determine who is the gateway or who is the DHCP server, it is our router number 2, which is 10.200.200.1. It provides the correct lease time of an hour, and you have the primary and secondary DNS servers as configured in our DHCP server on router number 2. So we could verify if it has route in place, and yes, it has a route or default route in place. And let us now check if it can reach public IP addresses. And yes, it is able to reach public IP addresses. Click start, yes. See if we have dynamic servers on our DNS settings, and yes, there is, so that we could test if we are able to resolve domain names. So for example, mikrotik.com. Yes, we are able to resolve mikrotik.com. youtube.com is also able to resolve. So our client number 2 is also in place, which is a DHCP connection. It acquired an IP address with the correct DNS servers and list time and default gateway, such that we have an IP route or default route here in our IP route setting. We are also able to determine that or verify that we are able to reach internet sites by typing in some public IP addresses and see if there is a response. So in this video, MikroTik configuration practice, network address translation, PPPoE and DHCP, we are able to fulfill the tasks needed to make this topology work. Our router number 1 is only doing network address translation with the connection to our ISP router, while our router number 2 is the PPPoE server and DHCP server, but it is not doing any network address translation, but instead it is doing route going to our router number 1. I hope you find this tutorial helpful and useful. Thank you for viewing.